Or to use a second example, and I think this one comes from Tim Keller, but if you imagine a fish in the ocean, and the fish says to you, I hate the restraints of this ocean. I want to be free. I want to go up on the land. Well, what would you say to the fish? You might begin by saying, how are you talking? But I mean, what you would really say to the fish is, no, you don't understand that the ocean is the place where you actually thrive most fully. And from a biblical perspective, that's what God's law is. It marks out this area in which you can thrive. If we're the fish, God's law marks out the ocean. So cultural reasons why we have a negative perspective on the law. And I think those cultural reasons can be questioned. Biblical reasons why we have a negative view of the law, especially Old Testament law, is the simple fact that there are times when Paul speaks pretty negatively about the law. Right. So you might think of Galatians, where Paul says in chapter 3, for as many as are of the works of the law are under a curse. For it's written, cursed is everyone who doesn't abide by all the things written in the law. Or again, Galatians 5, you've been severed from Christ, you who are seeking to be justified by the law. And so, we're hearing law together with words like curse, and we have this negative perspective on it. And sometimes think, oh, yeah, in the Old Testament, you were saved by keeping the law, and that's such a burden. And so we look on it negatively. Well, we have to come back and say, on the other hand, bear in mind in the New Testament, Paul can speak very positively of the law. So in Romans 7, he says the law is holy and the commandment is holy and righteous and good. Or in 1 Timothy, we know that the law is good if one uses it lawfully. Mm-hmm. So what's going on here? Sometimes we're hearing law and curse, and sometimes we're hearing law is good. How do you put these together? This is a huge debate in biblical circles, but the way that many people look at it, and this is the way that makes the most sense to me, is that when Paul is speaking negatively about the law, he's actually not speaking about the law as it's meant to be understood. He's speaking about the law as some people are misusing it. And so if you listen again to Galatians 5, you've been severed from Christ, you who are seeking to be justified by law. And the problem's not with the law. The problem is turning the law into something it was never meant to be. The law was never meant to be the way of salvation. When you read through the book of Exodus, when did the 10 Commandments come? Not before the Exodus from Egypt, but afterwards. The Old Testament, as well as the New, has always emphasized that salvation is by faith. But all that to say, many of us in the church have made the same mistake as the people that Paul is interacting with. And we somehow think the law is meant to be salvific, and so it becomes this huge burden. And I think what we need to remember is, no, salvation's always been by faith. And the law is not meant to earn you relationship with God. It's meant to guide you in relationship with God. The law is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. But anyway, that's the second reason, biblical reasons why we struggle with the law. The third set of reasons are what we might call historical reasons. And very briefly, if you think back to Martin Luther, he's growing up in a certain historical context where many people are teaching, salvation is by works. And Luther comes to a much better understanding of the gospel. He sees it's not salvation by works, but when he comes to the law, he tends to view it very negatively, and perhaps in part because of that context, that merit-based context he's come out of. And so when Luther speaks of the law, he tends to give it two functions. He gives it this civil function. So the law is a fence against sin. Laws like do not murder, they're meant to keep sin at bay, restraining the wicked. And then he gives it a second use called the pedagogical use. That is to say, the law is a teacher that shows you your sin so that you know you can't save yourself, you need a savior. So Luther has those two approaches to the law. And if you're, if you're listening carefully, you're seeing, oh, so every time I talk about the law, I'm talking about sin. So again, there's a negative context here. Well, then comes along John Calvin. And what Calvin does is he agrees with Luther's first two uses of the law, but he reframes them more positively. So in the first use, yes, the law is given to restrain sin, but also to make sure that we can have a society that is just and good. And with the second use, yes, the law shows us our sin. And by the way, especially in Reform circles, we often put a really heavy emphasis on the second use of the law. Sometimes so much so that every time you come to the Old Testament, you find yourself, well, how is it condemning me here so that I can see I need Jesus? And that doesn't excite you to open up your Old Testament. But Calvin comes along, he reframes it more positively. Yes, it shows us our sin, but also of God's gracious provision of a Savior. And then Calvin makes a crucial move. He adds a third use of the law, which is often known as the third use of the law. And the third use of the law is this aspect that the law is meant there to guide us in God's paths of righteousness, to walk after him in his ways. Again, Psalm 119, 105, your word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. So those are some of the different reasons that we struggle with the law. And I think with each of them, whether cultural, biblical, or historical, there are helpful responses that can maybe get us a bit closer to the psalmist in Psalm 119.
Well, it's really helpful, Jay. I like that a lot. Okay, so that's a good start. There are, oh goodness, crazy laws, right? We'll get to some of these specific laws, but still the subject is really, I think, overwhelming for a lot of people. And the human tendency when we're dealing with, overwhelming things that seem a little bit just out there, is we either simplify things too much or we tend to sort of categorize them. And traditionally, you talked about uses of the law, but traditionally, the Old Testament law has been categorized into, well, three categories, right? The tripartite division, as some people might say, into civil, ceremonial, and the moral law. A lot of us may have actually grown up with this, and we've been told to use this as sort of the rubric through which we understand Old Testament law. I'll put you on the spot. What do you think about that? Are there pros and cons to that approach? How would you respond to that?
Yeah, no, that's great. I'm guessing, especially given this church context, many have heard before that those three divisions of ceremonial, civil, and moral. Let me give you the pros, and then I'll give you two cons. The pros are that the goal of that division is to help you and me understand which laws no longer apply. That's the goal, and that's a great goal. And so, for example, ceremonial laws, those refer to things that Jesus has fulfilled, sacrifices. He's fulfilled. We don't need any more sacrifices. Or priests. He's our priest now. And so the ceremonial laws no longer apply. The civil laws, they don't apply in the same way, but they can give helpful guidelines for society. So you might don't build a parapet on the roof of your house. A parapet is this low wall. Well, and we might say, well, it no longer applies because in our day and age, we're not up on our roofs very much. In the ancient world, you went up there to sleep at night or dry your grain up there, etc. So that was a safety measure. We don't have that anymore, but we see, protecting life's important. And so we might say, build a fence around your pool. And then the moral law, the 10 Commandments, we would say those still do apply. So that's the goal of that three-partite division. The cons are the naming is a bit of a problem because once you use moral for one category, you kind of suggest that other categories aren't moral. But if you're an ancient Israelite, any law is a moral law. Same thing with civil. The 10 Commandments were as much a part of your civil life and legislation as much as the other commandments. So there's a bit of problem with the naming. They can imply the wrong thing. And the second thing is that sometimes these different categories can give the impression that ceremonial laws, for example, have nothing more to teach us because they're all fulfilled. So they're in the past. And now we just, look to the New Testament and that kind of thing. So there's nothing wrong with the categories. It's helpful to have those categories. We might want different names for the categories. But there are other approaches which are, I think, sometimes a bit more helpful.
Okay. So I think I know where you're going with this. I know you in your, I haven't read your second Leviticus commentary, but in the first one, you and others, Christopher Wright being another one, take a different approach, which is to try and, I think you call it the principle approach. Is that correct? You try and distill what the principle is. And can you just explain to us how that works? Because I know for a lot of us, the real question is, so what? Like, how do we apply this today? Like, I don't care what it meant back then. Is it relevant for today? How does this principle approach work, Jay?
Yeah, sure. I think you're right. That is the biggest question. And I think one of the reasons why often books like Leviticus in particular are such a struggle for us, because most of us have never lost sleep wondering, now, when I make a cereal offering, do I put the oil on first or so what the principle approach to law, it starts with this basic thesis, and that is that laws reflect the values of the lawgiver. Laws reflect the values of the lawgiver. And so, for example, that's fairly, I think, easy for us to see if we think of our own laws. So we have laws against murder. And why is that? What's the underlying value? Well, the underlying value is life. Or we have laws against stealing. What's the underlying value? Well, the underlying value is that we value the right to private property. And so taking a principled approach really says, so what's the underlying principle? What's the underlying value? What's the underlying ethic behind the law that we're looking at? Now, that's not always easy to see, but as an approach, it really helps you in I think, at least two ways. It helps you in that it really makes you think, okay, as opposed to just reading this at the do this, don't do that kind of level, what's the deeper value that the Lord is getting at here? One commentator says, when you read laws, he uses the analogy of the floor and the ceiling. He says a lot of laws often identify a minimum of behavior. Do not murder. That's the floor. But underneath them is this value that points to a much higher ethic to aim for. The value of life, that's the ceiling. And so when you begin to think about these principles, these values, the ethic behind the law, it really helps you to think, okay, what is it that the Lord's really wanting me to aim at here? You are not a righteous person simply because you've avoided murdering somebody. That's not what righteousness is. It's not less than that, but it's much more than that. So taking a value approach really helps with that. And I thought what I could do, and the second reason it helps you is because it then also helps you, it helps these laws become much more practical and to see the so what. Now, again, it's not always easy to do that. Sometimes we don't always know. Because it's often not stated and it's sometimes hard to discern. But there are different laws, and I brought three examples. I thought I'd share my screen and ask for you all to begin to think about what are some of the values behind the laws that I'm going to put up here. The first one is let me share my screen here. Here we go. Okay. So do you see Leviticus 19 there?
I'm not seeing it, Jay.
Oh, sorry, I'm not hitting, I did, because I didn't hit the share button. There we go.
All good.
Okay. So this is audience participation time. So here's the law, Leviticus 19. Leviticus 19 is the Sermon on the Mount of the book of Leviticus, if you will. And this is actually where you find love your neighbor as yourself. I once heard someone say, you know, we're not Leviticus people, we're love your neighbor as yourself people. And I thought to myself, spoiler alert, because that's right out of this chapter. So Leviticus 19, here's a law that goes as follows. When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. The gleaning was after you brought in the sheaves, there would be little bits of grain left. That would be the gleanings. So don't gather those. Don't go over your vineyard a second time or pick up the grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and the alien. I am the Lord your God. Okay, so what are the different values that you would say are at work behind that law?
Jay, do you want us to put our thoughts in the chat?
That'd be great.
Okay.
That'd be great.
So if you guys
I'll let you
want
read them
to,
out, Sogi.
There you go. I'll make sure that we're not completely failing here as a church. Okay, so care for those who are less fortunate. Care for the poor and the alien.
Yeah.
Generosity is a good sort of general observation. Ben is saying charity. Efficiency is less important than common good.
Yeah, did everyone hear that one? Efficiency is, or we might even say maximizing profit is less important than, because if you're leaving a whole edge unharvested, you know, you're not maximizing your profit at that point.
Yeah, avoiding greed, dignity of work.
Excellent, dignity of work. Yeah, you notice the law doesn't say harvest it and give it to folks. No, you're allowing people to maintain dignity by earning their own bread, if you will, by the sweat of their brow. And so, I mean, you guys are identifying this. This is one of the easier ones, but you see some of the different principles, values that are at work behind a law like this. Now, that's where there can be really good discussion as you come into the present. You think, what does this mean for my business, and how, you know, how would I apply these same kind of principles today? But let me give you a second example. Leviticus 22, do not bring anything, that is to say anything for sacrifice is the context here. So do not bring anything with a defect, because it will not be accepted on your behalf. When anyone brings from the herd or flock a fellowship offering to the Lord to fulfill a special vow or as a free will offering, it must be without defect or blemish to be acceptable. This is a bit more, requires just a bit more work on our part. What kind of values are at work here? Why would the Lord tell these ancient Israelite farmers, hey, when you bring an animal as sacrifice, make sure that it's one without defect? And of course, some of us are going to, it's going to be really easy for us to think ahead to the New Testament and Jesus, but try and stay just in the Old Testament context here. Why this kind of request?
All right, answers are coming in. God deserves our best. Give to God our best, not our seconds. It spotlights God's perfect nature. More answers along the lines of giving God our best, not our leftovers. Giving away a less desirable animal is not a sacrifice. Bring something that is costly. God wants us to bring the best because he's worthy of the best.
Yeah.
Nothing unholy should be in the presence of God. So more along the lines of holiness.
Yeah. Great. I mean, you all are picking up on, I think, what are some of the key values and principles at work here. If you think about, the kind of gift that you're taught to give to your mom on Mother's Day or your father on Father's Day, you're not supposed to just go out last minute and get those kinds of things. You put time into it, because the nature of the gift you give says something about how you view the person to whom you give the gift. And so that applies to the gifts that you give to God as well. There's a verse in Malachi here where the Israelites are being rebuked. And the Lord says through Malachi, when you bring blind animals for sacrifice, is that not wrong? When you sacrifice crippled or diseased animals, is that not wrong? Try offering them to your governor. Would he be pleased with you? And then the Israelite would go, I'd never offer that to the governor. Are you kidding me? And the Lord's point is exactly. And so the value behind this, the Lord values that we esteem him highly. Not because he needs his ego stroked or anything like that, but it's because what you think about God is the most important thing about you. And to see him as your creator and worthy of your best, that's what he values for you, because when you're in that position, you're relating rightly to him. All right, let me give you one more. This is from Exodus 22. If a man steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it or sells it, he will pay 5 oxen for the ox and 4 sheep for the sheep. So what are the values at work behind this law? And it's kind of, the values are working at kind of 2 different levels here. So go ahead. What are the values at work here?
All right, I'm going to read a couple. One says punitive damages, restorative justice, the early version. I think this is more than some. It's restorative justice. Punishment should be a consequence, but also within bounds. And let's see if there are others. That's what we've got so far.
And anyone have thoughts on why it's 4 sheep if you stole a sheep, but 5 oxen if you've stolen an ox?
Oxen is a capital good. Ox are more versatile, valuable. Sheep cost less because Jason says, because you had to really plan to steal the ox.
That's the first time I've heard that answer before. That's fantastic. Yeah. So yeah. So
there's a couple more. One says ox plows the field, and then it's harder or more costly to regain trust or peace than to break it. Must give 4 or 5-fold to make up for the sin. There you go.
Yeah. Okay. So you see these two different kind of general values that are that are behind this law. The one is, if you're stealing something, if you're committing offense against somebody, you have to, this is not where you're coming and confessing, right? This is where, no, you've committed the offense. You need to not only restore the damages, but there's penalty on top, which undoubtedly serves as something to try and dissuade people from heading this direction. So that's the one level. But on the second level, oxen are far more valuable than sheep. And so the level of the crime corresponds to the level of the punishment. If you steal a candy bar, you will receive a certain punishment. If you steal the Mona Lisa, your punishment will be far different. And so under underneath this law on stealing oxen and sheep, you already see at work this sense that, yeah, some crimes are more serious than others. And so the penalty will be higher, repayments higher, in order to try and especially dissuade this kind of behavior. So with all of these, you can begin to think about what is the underlying value behind this. You could ask a complementary question. You could also ask, well, if this is the floor, what is the ceiling? So if the floor is not stealing others' property, the ceiling would be, what would the ceiling be? If the minimum behavior is, yeah, you shouldn't take property that's not rightfully yours, what would the ceiling be? What's the higher ethic that you should aim for?
So answers coming in saying God values restoration, sharing property, treating others' property as more valuable than yours, generosity, 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 stewardship. Lend your ox when needed. And yeah, I think that's about it.
Okay, great. Yeah, so as I think about this in particular, and if you ever read through the Westminster Larger Catechism and you get to the 10 Commandments, they'll do this floor ceiling thing. So they'll say, yeah, murder means you shouldn't do these things, but it also means, and they go towards the ceiling. And so on something like theft, yeah, you shouldn't steal, but the ceiling is, how do you live in such a way that you help other people flourish? How do you not just take property from others, but do all you can to make sure other people's property is protected, cared for, and that people actually have property that helps sustain them? So floor ceiling, principles, values behind, these are different approaches you can take in reading the law.
That's really helpful, Jay. Thank you. I think you even admitted, though, that these are some of the easier laws where we can see the principle. Can I push you a little bit and pick on some more quirky, bizarre laws that may come across as, well, God is oftentimes portrayed by cynical people as being fill in the blank, right? Misogynist, genocidal, old, and God of antiquity, et cetera, et cetera. So there's one law that girls may not like as much, where in Leviticus 12 it says, it's the chapter on purification and childbirth. And it says that a woman who gives birth to a son is ceremonially unclean for 7 days. And then a few verses later, it says that if she gives birth to a daughter, she is ceremonially unclean for 2 weeks. It comes across as slightly unfair. Are we saying that the ceiling is that boys are to be valued more? I mean,
right.
There we go there.
Right.
Help us with something like that, just to start off.
Yeah, no, thank you, Silgi. The first thing I just want to say is there are lots of laws that when we read them and give them a quick glance and sometimes even a longer glance, they strike us as not simply as strange, but sometimes it's just plain wrong or unjust. And what I would encourage folks to do in coming across these kind of laws, so let me turn to Leviticus 12 specifically in just a moment, but in terms of approach, there are sort of 2 steps I encourage people to take, or at least mentally to remind themselves of when they read laws like that. Step 1 is simply be aware of your modern presuppositions. We are reading this in the 21st century with all sorts of presuppositions that may not have been a part of the original audience at all. And in fact, may seem equally strange. If we have Western presuppositions, some of our modern presuppositions seem very strange to Easterners. The individualism that many of us presume in the West, and you go to Africa, for example, not the East per se, but you go to Africa, and they're like, what in the world is that all about? It doesn't make sense to them. So the first thing is just be aware of your own presuppositions. And the second is sort of the other side of that coin. I sometimes get at this one just by beginning with a question. Have your words ever been taken out of context? And somebody has accused you of saying X when you know, hey, I meant Y, or I meant Z, or I meant D. I didn't mean X. And often when we say that's not what I meant, there's some anger behind it if there's been an accusation, because we feel we've been mistreated if we've been taken out of context. We understand that we want our words to be taken in the context in which they were spoken. And you see where this is going. We have to bring that same kind of desire, the desire that we have for our own words, we have to bring that to an ancient text. And so that means that we are aware many of these are spoken in a context that most of us are very unfamiliar with. So for example, ancient Israel, who's receiving this law, they're in a tribal culture. I'm guessing most people on this call have no idea what it is to grow up in a tribal culture. I certainly don't. Their culture was pre-modern. I'm guessing everyone on this call has no idea what it's like to grow up in a pre-modern culture. Their culture is honor and shame based. Now, some of us, especially if we've grown up outside the West, we might actually understand that, what it is to grow up in an honor, shame based kind of society. But many of us, especially if we've grown up in the West, we don't. So all that to say, as we approach these laws, I think we have to be really humble, being aware we've got a lot of modern presuppositions, and we're often really unfamiliar with the context in which the law was spoken. So taking those two steps, or with those two steps in mind, let me turn to Leviticus 12, the one that Sorgi mentioned. Now, when we as modern people read this law, the woman is unclean for 7 days if she's had a boy, but unclean 14 days if she's had a girl. Our conclusion is, well, there's an obvious reason for that. This was a patriarchal culture and they looked down on women. And I'd say, I understand why our mind jumps there, but I'd also say, hold on a second. Go back to Israel's culture and how they're hearing these laws. The first thing to bear in mind is that their story, their frame for hearing these laws is Genesis and Exodus, what those books teach. And in the very first chapter of Genesis, we read that male and female are created in the image of God, equally in the image of God. Now, that's just what you would expect to read if God valued women as highly as men. It's the exact opposite of what you'd expect if he thought women were second-class citizens. So Israel's Bible begins by saying male and female are of equal value. And whatever the reason behind Leviticus 12, we have to keep in mind that Genesis 1 is a guardrail for understanding. And that means it can't mean that women are somehow less valued than men. So what might it mean? Well, now here's the interesting thing. I've done a survey of different commentators, especially pre-modern commentators, most of whom lived in times that were far more patriarchal than the times we live in today. Now, what might you expect to read from a pre-modern man in a patriarchal time commenting on this text? Well, you and I might expect to read that these commentators just across the board are saying, yep, males are more valuable, et cetera, but that's actually not what you read. What you read are sometimes medical explanations that are given, sometimes non-medical explanations are given, but you're not reading pre-modern commentators coming across and denigrating women here. So for example, non-medical explanation. This is from somebody in 1810. And his suggestion was the circumcision. So if you read the law in its fullness, on day 7, the boy is circumcised. Right. And he suggested perhaps that somehow leads to him being cleansed or pure more quickly. Other commentators have taken a medical approach. So one pre-modern said, well, women bled longer after the birth of a girl. Now, medically, that's not correct. But again, he's writing in pre-modern times, and he's trying to figure out why this might be, but he's not going to the denigrating women kind of approach. Or another one, this is Rabbi Ishmael, and he's living like at the turn of the 1st century. So he right around New Testament times, and his suggestion was, well, the formation of boys in the womb was shorter than it was for girls. Now, again, that's incorrect, but the point not to miss, we have this extra sensitivity to male-female equality issues that it's wonderful because it's led to all sorts of wrongs being corrected and that kind of thing. But when we take that and read it onto this law, we might be making a mistake. And it's seeing these pre-modern interpreters, how they're reading the law, that begins to help us understand. If you're asking at the end, yeah, but why is it? The answer is, I don't know. In fact, for me, the answer is no one today knows, because we're just not told. There are a lot of laws where it's just, that's the way it is. And it's not meant to be a negative one way or the other. So anyway, so that would be my general approach to something like Leviticus 12.
That's really helpful, Jay. I've got someone who's asked a question, just a quick follow-up on that, and wondering if perhaps that, given that in that passage, in that chapter, it does specifically talk about the male circumcision, might one possibility be that it permitted the mother and women to attend the circumcision ceremony? Is anyone written on that?
Not that I'm aware of, because the mother also came with the child. Well, now just said, let me think through Leviticus 12. The mother certainly came to the tabernacle for her own purification during that point in time. Right. So I don't know that it would be related to that in particular. And then the other issue is there are actually 2 different periods of time, 7 and 14 days, and then 33 and 66 days. Right. So they're doubled both times for the female. So even if that explained the first, it wouldn't explain the second. Right. Okay. Yeah, but it's I mean, and this is the thing. Sometimes I use this example. In the book of Genesis, we know from the book of Genesis that Israelites did not eat the tendon on the thigh muscle on an animal. Now, some of you know the story that comes out of, and we'll get to that in a second. But if you did not know the story, if all you knew was Israelites didn't eat the tendon of the thigh, and I were to ask you, why is that? What would you guess? You might guess, well, tendons don't taste good, or you might guess they use the tendons for bowstrings, and all sorts of reasons. But you would never guess, oh, it's because Jacob, if you'd never heard the story, you'd never guess the reason behind that law. Jacob wrestled with an angel, and the angel touched the socket of his thigh. Mm-hmm. And so what happens is you have this custom, this law in Israel, and if you hadn't been told the story behind it, you'd never be able to explain why the law was there. And it could be the case with the law in Leviticus 12 that there's also some story that hasn't been recounted to us, and we're simply not able to guess it. All that to say, we often want to ask, these questions about rationale, and sometimes we just don't know. We just don't know.
Sometimes that's the best answer, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So what do we do with the death penalty? I mean, it's there
Mm.
in a lot of different laws. It's there for dishonoring parents to a certain degree, and then even adultery. I mean, these are things that happen in society today. We would
Mhm.
never prescribe that, even in
Yeah.
a church context. We wouldn't demand that. So, how do we understand the death penalty in the Old
Yeah.
Testament laws?
Yeah. So I think our starting point is the autonomy of the individual in a secular state. The autonomy of the individual in a secular state, their starting point is being members of the people of Israel whose king is God and whose purpose is to reflect his kingdom of goodness, justice, mercy, and love. The world's best hope for understanding who God is. That's their starting point. And so in any kingdom, one of the most serious crimes is treason. Because it's full revolt against the king and it undermines the security of the kingdom. And while all sin is in a sense treasonous, there were sins that were especially severe because of how they undermine the type of society that God envisions. So when it comes to adultery, for example, which you mentioned, Sylvie, and sexual sin in general, the Lord sets up a vision for humanity in Genesis chapter 1 and 2, where the family is foundational to the flourishing of society. To this day, studies not by Christian sociologists or psychologists, just by sociologists or psychologists of any stripe, have shown that children have the best chance of flourishing when they grow up in a stable family, and that type of flourishing in turn contributes to the well-being of society as a whole. Now, we live in a broken world, and that often doesn't happen. My parents, I'm from a family of divorce, so I understand that. But the point is, what the picture we see in Genesis 1 and 2, that's what God's ideal is for what we experience. And so when you undermine the family in particular, that's a serious act of treason, which adultery, of course, does do. Serious act of treason because it's attacking the very foundation of what the Lord has set up to be a key part of society that flourishes. Serious treason, therefore serious penalty. Let me turn it on its head for a second. How much pain, heartache, divorce, destruction of families would have been spared in this world if we treated adultery as seriously as the Bible does? So we read these laws. I mean, the final thing to say is we're no longer in this theocratic state. We are in a secular state. Um, the ability to carry out capital penalty is now not in the hands of the church. It's in the hands of the state. So, of course, if somebody in the church commits adultery, we're not going to execute them. No, in this period of redemptive history, that's not given to the church to do. But if they're unrepentant, what happens? Right? They'll experience excommunication, another way of being put outside of the people of God, sort of this ultimate penalty that you can apply to somebody within the context of the church. So again, that might not ease all of our concerns, but for me, it's just been so helpful to think through that lens of treason and to see how many of this in idolatry. I mean, why do you get killed for idolatry? That's the ultimate act of treason against the king in a society in which God is your king.
Yeah, the pre-monarchic context is really helpful in understanding that, isn't it? I got one more, I suppose, one that is more relevant, perhaps to some extent, as we're dealing with race issues and reparations and past, just having to stir up our ugly history, even in this country, but even around the world. It doesn't seem to be any explicit laws prohibiting Israelites to have slaves.
Mhm.
It is often said by people who, again, want to undermine Christianity or the Bible. Um, it seems like some laws assume that people will have slaves. And so I guess it begs the question, does the Bible condone slavery? Is it turning a blind eye? Help us understand that difficult topic a little bit, if you
Yeah,
can.
yeah, no. Um, Exodus 21 has
Mm.
laws that usually the translations use the word slave about slaves. Leviticus 25, the same thing. Um, and so what I would say, I just make four comments quickly. The first would be that the Hebrew word that's often translated as slave is eved. And eved actually has a really wide range of meaning. It can mean somebody who is a slave in the sense that you and I think when we hear slave. When you and I hear slave, we think of a chattel slave. That is to say, somebody who's been kidnapped um, from their own country or people, and somebody who is treated as nothing more than property. The master can do whatever he wants because it's his property. And the response here would be to say the word eved can refer to somebody who's treated in that kind of way, like the Israelites in Egypt. They were slaves, but it can also refer to different types of servants. And I think actually, as you read through the laws in Exodus 21 and Leviticus 25, servant is a far better translation. The Bible actually forbids kidnapping people. If that law alone had been paid attention to, it would have decimated the slave trade in America and England in the previous centuries.
Mm.
The Bible gives servants rights, including freedom from abusive masters, which again would have decimated the slave trade as we think of it. So the best translation is actually servant, not slave. And that leads into the second point. Usually the reason that somebody was in servanthood or entered into servitude was because of debt. And so Israelite servanthood, the laws about servants in Exodus 21, Leviticus 25, usually you're talking about people who were in debt and therefore like we would use the modern language of indentured servants. That is to say, somebody who agrees to work for a period of time in order to discharge a financial responsibility. And your experience of that servanthood was, or could at least could be very much like employment, modern day employment, or like joining the military, where in exchange for your service, you're given food, shelter, clothing, that kind of thing. In fact, it could be such a positive experience that some of the laws talk about servants who want to remain lifelong servants in their master's household.
Mm.
And while debt's never ideal, we need to remember that in that day and age, the chance to enter into the security of a home with food and shelter could literally be a lifesaver.
Mm.
The third thing to keep in mind is that we also struggle sometimes because commercial language can be used when describing servants in the Bible. It can talk about buying them or inheriting them. And again, in our mind, we just think, oh, that means they're chattel property. But I think we need to remember we actually do the same thing. When we're talking in a commercial context about people, think of sports stars. What do you do with a sports star? You trade them to another
Mm.
team. You know, that's what you do with stocks. You trade stocks. You're not saying that the sports star is a stock or an employee. If your employer moves your job from Ohio to Pennsylvania, you've been transferred, just like we transfer funds. So we use this commercial language in these contexts, but not because we're saying those employees or those sports stars are just chattel. The final thing to keep in mind is simply this, in the kingdom of God, we will all be servants. We will all be an Eved. And the goal of Israelite masters was to so imitate God the Father that they gave their Israelite servant a taste of that coming day.
Amen. Yeah, and actually, a lot of the laws are designed to be incredibly generous to these eveds, right? I mean, even releasing them, or the laws, the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, which basically seem to suggest as if any harm has been done to them. The Old Testament is so much more generous than the other laws that we know in other nations around that
Oh yeah.
time. Yeah,
Yep. Yeah.
that's really helpful. A couple comments on, I think, slavery here. It's David's pointing out that it's illegal to return a runaway slave.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and there's a question about what about the passage that allows Israel to have slaves who are foreigners and keeping them for perpetuity in Leviticus 25. Do you want to briefly address that one, or?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. Yeah, I have a brief answer. I've gone into quite a bit more detail in the longer commentary I've written on Leviticus. I guess two comments. One is in Leviticus 25, the context there is, hey, to fellow Israelites, your own family, when the Jubilee comes, they get to go free. Now, that's an act of extreme generosity. If somebody's deeply indebted to you, if you owe $30,000 still on the mortgage, and that 30,000 gets wiped out, wow, that's an extreme act of generosity. And so that's what's being mandated for those within the Israelite family. It's saying if you still owe that 30,000, you're not an Israelite, though. An Israelite isn't required to just dismiss the debt. And that doesn't make it unfair. It just means the emphasis is on, hey, with your own family, you show special care, which I think that's how most of us interact with our families. The second thing to bear in mind is that if we read this in its context, there were ways, we know this from other ancient Near Eastern laws, that actually you could get out of your servanthood. There are ways to buy yourself out or get out. So yeah, the law is really focusing on you're not obligated to let them go in the year of Jubilee, but that's not precluding that there were other ways they could have gotten out of that servanthood. But again, I go into more detail in the longer commentary. And if the person who asked that question would like more, if Sobi can put you in touch with me, and I'm happy to send you that snippet from the commentary.
Buy the book, Derek. That's the short. No. All right. So in a bit, we're going to have about probably 10 minutes or so for questions. So if you want to start, either just let me know that you want to personally ask Jay a question. That's absolutely fine. Or just put it in the Q&A and we can look at those and just, I don't know, maybe pick a handful, Jay. But I want to close. We can't end this without talking really practically. And by that, I mean, well, maybe you can help us. Well, could you give us some words of encouragement about how we might be able to benefit from reading the law today, but also because we know, I think, very opaquely that the law points us to Jesus. But how, maybe just inspire us a little bit on that. How can we benefit from reading this? Why should we read Leviticus, and then help us maybe see more clearly how the law points us to Jesus?
Yeah. In general, when you're reading the law, let me give you maybe two general things to keep in mind, and then talk about how to get to Jesus. The two general things to keep in mind would be, first of all, remember the third use of the law. That is to say that it's meant to be a light to your path, a lamp for your feet. It's certainly not wrong to remember the second use of the law, which is it shows you your sin. But sometimes we focus so much on that we approach the Bible asking the question, what am I not doing here? What am I doing wrong? Or if there's a negative, there's a story and there's a negative character, how am I like that negative character? Or if someone does something positive, how do I fail to do that positive thing? And we're just always taking it and using it to beat ourselves up. And I just say, oh, brother, sister, just remember that third use of the law. A good parent gives laws not to be oppressive to his or her children, but to guide them and help them to flourish. So remember that posture as you approach the law. And then secondly, just remember that aspect of looking for the underlying principle. What is it that God values? And remember that floor and ceiling. Is there a higher ethic that this is pointing to here? And again, if you have a Westminster Confession of Faith, and you go to the section on the 10 Commandments, you'll see a bit of a model for how they're doing that with the 10 Commandments. But in terms of getting to Jesus, again, it's not wrong to have that second use. Oh, I'm failing here. I need Jesus. Absolutely. But remember, you can frame that in terms of grace. Yes, I failed here, but wow, what a loving Savior. What a loving Father to make this way of grace for us. I'm just so thankful, Lord. And then the second way, if you will, that you get to Jesus is just begin to meditate on, well, how are the ways that I've seen Jesus live out the value of the whatever law it is that I'm reading? And let me look to him and ask him for his help in doing the same. When Jesus talks about getting in the yoke with him, I used to think that was it's like I'm wearing the yoke, a single yoke way out front, and Jesus is back here with the reins. But I think it's much more likely that it's actually a double yoke. And Jesus is the one walking with us in the yoke. This is why it's a yoke that's easy and a burden that's light. And so just to be able to remember that he delights to help us. And so as you look to the law, try and think through, what are the ways I see Jesus live out the values of this law? And then ask for his help in doing the same.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah, if you've got questions, please send them in now. And while you do that, Jay, I heard a rumor once that you made students like follow some of the dietary laws and things like that for a whole week or something like that. Can you just to give people some time to put in questions?
Yeah.
But
it was even better. I had students live Levitically for a week. So not just food laws. Okay. I said, follow as many of the laws of Leviticus as you can without getting arrested. And during the week, keep a journal every day. And so, reading through these journals and, one person's like, I can't wear clothing of mixed fibers. There goes 95% of my wardrobe. Or one person, he had his entry one day, I really miss bacon. I mean, that was it. That was his entry. But you know what the amazing thing was? By day 3 or 4, almost every student had a comment along these lines. I have spent all my waking hours, the past 4 days, thinking about ritual purity, how to avoid it, how to cleanse myself, and ritual impurity, how to avoid it, how to cleanse myself, and ritual purity, how to be pure and clean. And all of a sudden it struck me, if that's what God wants at the ritual level, how much more does he want that to be true at the moral level? How much more does he want that to be true of my heart? Wow, I serve such a holy God. And I read through those and I had my own spiritual revival because it was just so invigorating, refreshing, reading all of these people, brothers and sisters in Christ, who were just seeing anew the holiness of the Lord.
That's great. I'm going to have to figure out a way to. Undergraduate students wouldn't do that, though. They
might get into it.
Yeah, they might. It could cause serious problems. All right, I think a couple questions are coming in. Let me see here. There've been a couple people who have just asked about polygamy generally. Do you want to tackle that one in any way, shape, or form?
Yeah, the things I would say briefly to that, and let me begin, of course, by saying briefly, in part because of time, not because it's unimportant. Um, I had a dream once in which Ski was actually married, was going to be married to another man while still being married to me. And I remember the emotions I felt waking up from that. It was just terrible. So briefly, not because it's not an unimportant issue at all. The things I'd say very quickly would be one, Genesis 1 starts out with what really is what God intends for marriage to be. This is heterosexual marriage between one man and one woman. In fact, the first time that you ever read of somebody who marries more than one woman, it's in Genesis 4, and he's presented as the most ruthless, evil man. His name's Lamech. So that's one. The second thing to keep in mind is that sometimes the Bible teaches through explicit law. Often it teaches by way of narrative. And Gordon Wenham, I think, makes a very good argument that as you read through the narratives that involve more than one wife, bigamy, whatever, that it almost is always something that you look at and think, I would never wish that for myself. So that's, the Bible itself is giving these narratives in part, Wenham argues, to say, this is something you're not supposed to do. The third thing to note is that we, again, modern presuppositions, we come to the text thinking, oh, this happened all the time, and it happened because the husbands were sex starved or sex crazed. Well, you read through the narratives, and one, it's usually only those who are very wealthy who can even afford to do this. So it's not something that's incredibly common. Secondly, in many of these narratives, it's often the wife who's the one saying, hey, marry my maidservant here so that I can have children by means of her, kind of thing. And so, you know, again, we think in terms of, oh, just deep desire here on the part of the man for sex, whereas in reality, it was often related to issues surrounding infertility and childbirth. The final thing to say is, I think there actually is a law in Leviticus that does say, it's often translated, you shall not marry a woman in addition to her sister. So we think, oh, it's prohibiting at least like the Leah and Rachel kind of situation. We saw how badly that went. I think a good case can be made, you shall not marry a woman in addition to another. It's another way you can translate. So I think there actually is one law that says this is not something you're supposed to do. So that would just be some quick thoughts on that.
Yeah. A very practical question, which I think is a great question. By Brad, what is the best way to approach this study of Leviticus for personal Bible study?
Yes. So one thing, I'm hesitating just a moment here because the way I've encouraged folks, I don't want this to sound self-serving in any way. Sugi knows me well. He'll tell you Jay is not about, because Leviticus involves so much background information that it's helpful to have a lot of cultural context that we just don't have. Often you will need the help of some sort of guide. And I wrote a commentary on Leviticus. It's in the Tyndale series. It's fairly brief. And what I've encouraged folks to do over the years is when you get to Leviticus in your Bible study, if you can borrow a copy of that commentary or whatever, it begins with a 300 to 400 word section called overview. And so I tell folks, read the overview, then read the chapter, and then at the end of the chapter, after you've read the chapter in the Bible, in the commentary, I've got overview, then I go through and I explain all the verses, And then at the end, I have another 400-word section called something like application or meaning. And so, of course, you can dip in if you have questions on the verses, but if you just read that overview, read the chapter, and then read that 400 words at the end, that's where I try to help the reader to know, hey, how might this apply to you today? And so reading those two sections might add 4 or 5 minutes to your reading time, but I think it can really help you when you come to a book like Leviticus, which just has so many laws in it that are so foreign to us today.
Yeah, the Tyndale commentary that Jay mentioned is very accessible. It's written so that yeah, I think anyone who is somewhat familiar with the Bible can pick it up, and it will be a great companion to reading. Because I mean, we're talking about even the priest, the rules for ordination and so on and so on. And it gets a little bit tedious, and again, without understanding the context, it can be quite yeah, feeling like you're in the wilderness. A couple quick questions, if that's okay, and we'll wrap it up. So, question on law informing or guiding Christian worship today. Do you have any thoughts on that, particularly the ceremonial law? Does it have any sort of guidance for us in terms of how we should do worship?
Yeah. So I don't think there's anything, I'd want to say on the one hand, because we're under a new covenant, we want to be careful not to make something prescriptive from Leviticus for how we worship today. So that's on the one hand. But on the other hand, I would say that I think many I'll use myself. I grew up in an evangelical context, which looked down pretty negatively on any sense of liturgy. In the context I grew up in, and I think this is true for many in the evangelical church today, liturgy is associated with dead faith. We think of it as impersonal and very detached from really expressing our heart. And Leviticus has really challenged me in that way, because here you have a book given to us from God about how to worship, and it's got this liturgy in it. The different sacrifices follow a certain order and this kind of thing. And it made me realize, actually, the different times that we use something almost like a liturgy, the different liturgies of our culture. Like we have a liturgy, if you will, around what you do at Thanksgiving. We have a liturgy around what you do at birthdays, and we actually use these to mark an occasion as one that's really important. And so it's made me realize, maybe my view of liturgy has to change. Maybe instead of looking at some of these rituals, that's the word I'm looking for, we use rituals to mark out that which is important. Maybe I should rethink and realize that maybe some rituals in worship would actually be a way of helping to highlight the importance of what's going on.
Okay, great. And I think this is a good one to end on, Jay, but I think it's a more personal question for you. How has studying Leviticus and the law personally transformed your love and understanding of God, the law giver?
About a year into my studies in England, I was studying Leviticus like 9 to 5, 5 days a week. And I was focusing especially on sacrifice and atonement and what those things meant. And by the end of the first year, I'd be in church, and I went to a church where there was all the worship songs went up on a screen. And if a song ever went up that had mention of atonement or ransom or sacrifice, it was almost impossible for me not to cry, because I understood so much more deeply just the sheer grace of the Lord in making a way of salvation for us. One of my favorite verses, I repeat it to myself every time I take communion, is Leviticus 17:11. And it says, in the Hebrew, it reads, Ki nefesh habasar badamhu, for the life of the flesh is in the blood. And then it says, Va'ani nutativ lechem al hamatbeh, and I myself have given it to you on the altar. That is to say, and that extra I usually doesn't come through in the English translation.
Right.
But God is saying, when it comes to sacrifice, as one author put it, he's reversing the conceptual direction. We think of a sacrifice as something we give to God, and that's certainly true. But he's saying here, atoning sacrifice, do you know why it works? It works because I, the offended one, have agreed to make a way that your sin can be atoned for. He wasn't obligated to do that. He chose to do that in his love for us. And you see that then when you get to Jesus, only magnified, because now it's not just that he's accepting a sacrifice, he's provided it. He's provided the payment on our behalf. And so it has just made the love of God and the sacrifice of Jesus all the sweeter for me.
Amen. Yeah, well, thank you so much for sharing that. It is funny how we think of like ransom payment today. It's it's almost the opposite, isn't it? When we think, when you mentioned the aggrieved party, God is the aggrieved one, yet he provides the restitution, the payment for that in his son. And so it really is completely taken out of our hands. There's nothing we can do. It's something that God himself does. Well, thank you so much, Jay. This has been an absolute feast. Working through some example. I have a whole list. I might just call you and ask you a whole bunch of questions. There's some others here that we weren't able to get to, but I think you've given us a really, really good, just a big picture understanding of your way of approaching the Old Testament law, trying to see the character of God behind these laws. I know that you've said, I think in your commentary, appealing to the fact that God does not change, that he's the same yesterday, today, and forever. And so we should expect that what he instituted as law in the Old Testament, that there would be things there that we can learn from it. So, and I can tell people have been asking, well, how do we make this relevant for us? How do we study it today? So, and I think you've just really lit the fire under us for that. So we're so grateful. Thank you very much, Jay. And thank you for everyone for showing up. People have come in and out. It's been great to have you. We look forward to seeing you guys in our next session in a fortnight. But let's say, if we can all sort of, I will clap on behalf of everyone. Thank you very much, Jay.
My pleasure.
For your time. So we'll say goodbye now, and we look forward to seeing you again.